Welcome, everyone. We're here to talk about lead exposure, and the impact on the health of children and adults. This is an important topic because lead has many impacts on health of children and adults, but mental health is an area which is particularly sensitive to the impact of lead. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you, which I'll link in a moment. So just wait a second, and here we go. Here we go. The impact of lead on brain and mental health. First of all, a little bit of history. It's been known for many years that there was adverse impacts of lead on people's health. 2000 BC. In Greece, the poet and the physician Nicander described hallucinations and paralysis after lead exposure. In Rome, there was extensive use of lead in water pipes, in cups, in jugs, in cosmetics, and in wine. And there have been speculation that this lead may have possibly contributed to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. In 19th century England, neurologic symptoms of lead poisoning were described, including seizures, paralysis, and death. In the 1930s, Randolph Byers and Elizabeth Lord at the Boston Children's Hospital described learning difficulties and behavioral problems due to lead exposure at lower doses than those which caused seizure and paralysis and death. In the 1950s to today, work has focused on lower levels of lead. And these have been found to decrease IQ, to increase the likelihood of a child getting attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and to contribute to crime. Now, before going further, I need to just focus on this, which is the blood lead level of concern, the level at where intervention is clearly needed. This is 5 micrograms per deciliter on the top, or this is equivalent to 0.24 micromoles per liter. In Canada, we use the bottom, but widely around the world, many studies are done in micrograms per deciliter. It's important to note that this 5 micrograms per deciliter is the level of concern in the United States and in Canada. In Canada, our Canadian Pediatric Society guidelines are 5 micrograms per deciliter. The effect of lead and lead exposure on intelligence quotients, or IQ, is of interest because it is log linear. That is, you have quite a dramatic effect as you increase the concentration of lead from 0 to 5 micrograms and then to 10 micrograms. And as you go higher, you get less of an increase, comparatively speaking. What this means is that those early exposures down at 5 micrograms per deciliter or lower can be quite important in having an impact on IQ. Now, for example, going from 0 to 5 micrograms per mil is a fall of 4 or 5 points in IQ. And when you look at this, that doesn't, in a way, sound like much. But if you look carefully at the impact of the whole population, it's a lot. Let me explain. This is from a book produced by Pure Earth and UNICEF last year in 2019, The Toxic Truth: Children's Exposure to Lead Pollution Undermines a Generation of Future Potential. And what they show is this impact of IQ changes. And they put this in a perspective. This is the distribution of IQ scores in US children in this case. But you can see that this is a Gaussian distribution with the majority around 100 and then a fall off in both directions. But you will see here on the right, 6 million gifted children, and on the left, 6 million children with an intellectual disability. Now, if you just shift everybody 5 points on IQ, what happens is this, that instead of 6 million out of 100 million gifted children, you now only have 2.4 million. And of children with an intellectual disability, instead of 6 million, you now have 9.4 million. This is a 57% increase in intellectual disability in the population. This is a huge difference, and you can see what an impact a small change in intelligence quotient can have spread throughout an entire population. Increasing blood lead levels are associated with increasing attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Now, this is a behavioral issue. It's not the only behavioral issue associated with lead. But what you notice here is that these are blood lead concentrations, and this is above 2 micrograms per mil. This is not even getting to 5 micrograms per mil, but above 2 micrograms per mil. The adjusted odds ratio is over 4. In other words, a child is 4 times as likely to get ADHD. If you're in this lower but still significant level above 1, it's 2 to 2.5 times as likely to get ADHD. So these are effects which are seen at low concentrations. And that's one of the reasons why it has become much more important now to understand this, because not too long ago, we didn't believe that there were such effects at such low concentrations. One of the measures that has been used is to look at crime. Now, this is interesting in this sense that there's a tremendous documentation of crime, homicides, violent crimes, and so on, going back many, many years. And with the ability to mix and match databases, what's now coming out, and this is a study that was done in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I think it was published in 2018, so just a little over 2 years ago. What they found, this is the percent ever arrested for a violent crime. These are blood lead levels taken between 2 and 3 years of age, for the most part. And what they found is that children who had higher blood lead levels, and look, we're looking at, here's 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. This is increases, and a big increase, as we shown from the log linear curve, is really between 0 and 10, but that there's a big effect already at 5 and 6. In these children, what was done is that they intervened with every child who had 2 tests of lead, which were over 10. And so they have an intervention group, this 10I, which is this group. And when these children were given an intervention to reduce the lead, this was to get rid of the lead paint or lead in water pipes, and it was also to address nutrition and behavioral issues. And what they found was that they were able to dramatically reverse the effect of lead on crime. This group here had above 10 micrograms per deciliter initially, and then on the second test, it didn't meet the above 10 criteria that they were using then, but it was between 5 and 10 at a level which we now recognize is very significantly affected. And so these were a valid control to this, and this is probably the closest we'll ever get to what's called a randomized controlled trial. in which you've got an intervention and you've got a control group, and you've got, in this case, a really astounding dramatic effect, an ability to reduce crime. Now, we could look at this in terms of other measures of mental health, but this is actually one of the areas where there's the most solid data, and what it shows are very striking. So when we get to specifically looking at lead on mental and brain health, beyond general impacts like crime, Daniel Rhodes and a group at Harvard in 2003 showed that bone lead levels in middle-aged to elderly men, those who had increased bone lead had an increased depression and anxiety compared with those who had low blood lead levels. And this increase was very significant. They looked at bone lead because lead is stored in bone. It behaves much like calcium, and lead crosses into the body from the intestine on a calcium transporter. And when it gets into the body, in the blood, it gets transported and stored in the bone like calcium does. And if you have circumstances, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, which you get calcium released from the bone, then that bone can increase lead levels. So bone is the best measure in people who are older of what the long-term lead level has been, or what long-term lead exposure is. So they looked at bone lead levels in middle-aged to elderly men. There was an increase in depression and anxiety. And they were looking at blood lead levels, mean here, which was around 6 micrograms. So it's fairly low levels. Now, Maurice Bouchard at the University of Montreal took this a step further. She looked at adults aged 20 to 39. She's looking at several thousand with higher blood lead levels. This is, in this case, above 2.1 micrograms per deciliter. There was an increased risk of major depressive disorder, that they were 2.3-fold, more than twice as likely to have a major depressive disorder, and almost 5 times as likely to have a panic disorder, compared with those with the lowest blood lead level at 0.7 micrograms per deciliter. So we're seeing here effects in adults. We're seeing here effects not only in adults, but at very low levels. And that's very important because up until recently, it was felt that adults were much less susceptible to problems of lead toxicity than children. Here's the third study, or another study done by Yanhong Liu. Now, he was working at the University of Pennsylvania, but he's originally from China. And this study was done in children in Jintan in China. These children had blood lead concentrations at ages 3 to 5 years. And at 6 years of age, there was increased teacher-reported behavioral problems, including with emotional reactivity, anxiety problems, and pervasive developmental problems. And the mean blood lead level of all the children that they studied was just over 6 micrograms per deciliter. So one can see on children's behavior and anxiety on adults, we're starting to see a pattern here. This was a study done and reported in 2017. Alex Winter and Robert Sampson, who are at Harvard, they looked at adolescents in Chicago who were aged 16 to 18, and they assessed them for their behavior and mental health. And these children had a mean of 2.6 blood lead tests between birth and 6 years of age. And the mean blood lead of everybody was about 6 micrograms per deciliter. What they found was that impulsivity increased by 6%, and anxiety and depression by 9% for each microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead level. Right? So if it goes up, the blood lead level goes up by 5 micrograms per mil, you're looking at about a 30% increase in anxiety or depression and a 45% increase. A 30% increase in impulsivity and a 45% increase in anxiety or depression. So quite significant findings. 2018, Aaron Rubin at Duke University, he compiled all the evidence relating to lead and dementia and Parkinson's disease, and concluded that adults exposed to lead clearly have an increased risk of Parkinson's disease, and there is significant evidence of cognitive decline in those with high lead levels in Alzheimer's disease-related domains. There's not, at this juncture, a sufficient evidence to say that lead causes Alzheimer's disease or is a contributor to it, but the evidence is certainly at this point suggestive. Trehani Fonseka, who's from Toronto in 2017, suggested that there may be a relationship between lead poisoning and suicide. And what she and her co-workers found was, number one, that lead poisoning levels were high among the Indigenous population of Northwestern Ontario. This would date back to the 70s and in the era before lead was removed from gasoline. And she ascribed much of this to sniffing of gasoline by youth, and that resulted in exposure of those youth to high levels of lead and high blood lead. That becomes important not only for those youth, but where those youth are women in particular. We know that the lead gets across the placental barrier, and so that the lead can get into the infant and the fetus in significant amounts and cause an impact on the next generation. And she described and talked about the impact of lead on various biochemical pathways, which are associated with an increased risk of suicide and suicidal ideation. Her final conclusion was that there's more research on this needed, but it's certainly a concern. Now, let's talk about this in terms of the situation in Manitoba. Where are we here in our province? What do we know? This is an examination of more than 5,000 blood lead tests done in Manitoba in 2011 all the way through to 2018. And these were done all over the province. And of these tests, in each year between 8 and 14% of these tests were high. This is 0.24 micromole per liter. That's the same as 5 micrograms per deciliter. So there are a significant number of people with high lead in Manitoba. We don't know precisely who they are because all they gave us in the FIPA was information on the blood lead tests. This is the number of blood lead tests which were high, and it's going up in part because there are more blood lead tests being done. But you can see it's essentially doubled over this period in terms of the number of positive tests. In Winnipeg, this is a map, of course, of Winnipeg. The red areas are areas where there are lead water pipes. And it's widely known that one of the sources of lead in lead poisoning is from lead water pipes. This is people who will remember the Flint, Michigan situation as an example. Now, there was an assessment of the levels of lead in the water. And what it was found is that 20% of the homes with lead water pipes in Winnipeg had high water levels of lead. So it's a significant impact. There's not been a correlation of the blood lead levels with these water pipes. Although from the blood lead levels that we got, what we found is that those were taken in Victoria Hospital were low. Those taken at the Grace Hospital were low. Those taken at the Health Sciences Center and St. Boniface were higher. And those taken at Seven Oaks and Concordia were intermediate. So it suggests that there may be a correlation between these, the lead water, and where there are lead, high blood lead levels that have been taken. Although this may also be because those are areas where there are older homes and more likely to have lead paint. Now, reported in the end of 29, the study was actually not released until 2020. It was done by an extrinsic corporation company in Ontario, and they assessed the levels of lead, and they used the levels of lead to predict what the blood lead levels would be in different communities in Winnipeg. And here's what they found. This is based on the soil levels, and from other studies. They used a model. They predicted the average blood lead level in children who are under 3 years of age. And for North Point Douglas, what they found was, or their prediction was, that the average blood lead level would be above 5 micrograms per deciliter. That's extraordinarily high and very, very concerning. For Weston, it was above 3. For Daniel McIntyre, area above 2. And even these areas here, although the average is low, the average is high enough to suggest that there's going to be, in those areas, some kids who are higher. Now, they also predicted the percent of children, and this time instead of being 0 to 3, it's 0 to 7, who would have greater than 2 micrograms per deciliter blood lead level. And what you see, this is extraordinary. North Point Douglas, way over 90% of children above 2 micrograms per deciliter. Weston, 70%, Daniel McIntyre, 40%. And so even these are higher than you would like, and compared to the background, which is virtually 0.
John, we have a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat about oops, sorry, just scroll back here, about a couple of specific slides. One was from Shirley. Says, great slide that says an important story. What was the sample size?
Which one is that?
I don't know. Shirley, if you want to unmute yourself, you can maybe provide some information. And for all others going forward, if you want to just raise your hand right beside your chat feature, there should be a raise your hand, and then we can ask or get you to ask your question.
Yes, this was the guide. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting guide, and it says such an interesting story about what should be done and what the problems are. And I just wondered what the sample size was for that.
Okay. So the total sample size here was just about 3,500 children. What is also important is that there were 2,000 children who were, I think, either below 5 or 5 micrograms and less. So that they had a large number of children down at the lower end. And that's actually very important in terms of establishing what your baseline is. Some other studies have been in areas where they're dealing with levels which start at 4 or 5 micrograms per deciliter. And so you're looking at an area where it's hard to see differences. But if you've got a very large number down here, then now the number who were in these two groups, the intervention group and the non-treated or non-intervention group, I think we're between 100 and 200. So not a super large number, but enough that this is statistically significant. And they looked at a whole series of parameters for these kids. I'm just showing you the violent crime, but it was how they were doing in school, school absences, and so on. And in each case, you got a very similar pattern. It's really kind of an extraordinary study.
Yes, it's such a large number, and that it was statistically significant. Yeah. That's really good data to inform.
Now, most of these others had around 2,000. I think there was one that was just something over 1,000, but they're good studies from good places with adequate numbers of kids. And I mean, there have been some studies in the United States and Rhode Island and elsewhere where they're actually dealing with larger numbers of kids than that. But they're looking at it, not so much at the mental health issues, but other. Okay.
She also wanted to know how many people were tested every year.
Oh, okay. So if we go back here, these were, the regimen at that point was to test kids between 1 and 3 years of age. And so most of them were. And then when they were greater than 10, they would retest them. For children who were above 10 in there and being interventioned or had an intervention, they would often test them later on. And they did show that the blood lead levels declined.
I'm very interested in the Manitoba data. How many, what is the size of the sample for that when you're showing, I guess, one slide back, and when you're showing, yeah.
Okay, so we've got 5,000 tests from here to here total over this 8-year period. So that's going to be, back here, you're probably talking about 400 or 500, and up here, you're talking about 1,000 a year, close to it. Now, these were done and ordered all over Manitoba. They were ordered presumably by physicians, and presumably because they had some reason to suspect that there might be a concern about lead. So it doesn't give you an understanding of what the total population is. They are not a random sample. All it says is that we do have people in Manitoba who are testing high.
Okay. And Kate has a question.
Okay.
You can unmute yourself now, Kate.
There we go. I got it. Okay. Yes, I did. I live in North Point, Douglas, and we're already looking at the effects of contaminants in our neighborhood. We're very, very concerned.
Yeah.
We know that some of it comes from old industrial, some of it comes from Western scrap. But a lot of it also comes from old lead pipes, which I think you mentioned.
Yep.
We live in probably the poorest neighborhood, and yet if we want that fixed, we have to pay for it ourselves. Personally, as far as I know, that's what we've been told. Is there some way that this can be addressed? Because this is a neighborhood, as you probably know, there's a lot of children with problems, and there's a fair bit of crime among youth and so on. So there may or may not be a relationship between the lead in our soil and water and problems that children are having. But we really would like to know, how do we get the attention of the powers that be to address this and to replace these pipes and to address the contaminants? Because it's a big problem.
I'm with you 100%. This is something that really needs to be done.
Yes.
I'll talk a little bit about this later on.
Okay.
And so maybe I'll wait for that, but I will go back, where is it, to this slide.
Yeah.
The lead mitigation that they did in Charlotte, North Carolina, in this area, the average cost was, and this would have been lead mitigation, which was done in the early 2000s. The average cost was something over $7,000 US, right, to address the water and the paint. In particular, there could be occasionally soil contamination too. Mm-hmm. So this was a very important study, in part because they were so thorough. And they used a mix of public funds, where there were families who could afford it, they could chip in, but if they couldn't afford it, they used foundations and other sources of funds. Mm-hmm. But they put together the funding. They were absolutely determined to address this, and the average expenditure per household was more than $7,000 US. All right, so that's the sort of thing that we have to do here.
Yeah, and my neighborhood, you'll be lucky to find anybody that can do that.
No, and that's why we need public funding.
Yes, absolutely. It's a serious public health problem.
Yeah, in this area in Chicago, we are behind. Right? They have been doing testing, monitoring, helping families. They have a similar program to what was in Charlotte, North Carolina. And what they've been able to demonstrate is that 20 or so years after this started, they can show that the poor areas no longer have such a big increase in lead levels in the kids as they used to. And so that this investment, which has predominantly gone into areas which are less well off, has been very important in providing greater equity across areas of Chicago.
Okay. Well, thanks, and I'll be watching the rest here. But
yeah.
That's my main concern here. Look at that. Look at North Point Douglas here.
No, it's astounding, and it's very, very worrisome. Yeah. And thank you, Kate. I would love to talk to you afterwards and work with you on this.
Oh, okay. I'm on the Point Douglas Residents Committee, and I'm representing the Residents Committee here. So. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so this is where we were. Now, we looked again, this was a Freedom of Information request. The number of children and youth per postal code, age 6 to 19 with a conduct disorder, a behavioral disability. Okay, so these are for the averages for Winnipeg, across all Winnipeg. In Weston, you see an increase in the number of kids with conduct disorder, and that increase is even larger in North Point Douglas, and that's the sort of thing that you were talking about. This is the number of children and youth aged, again, 6 to 19 with mood or anxiety disorders. This is, again, the number of children and youth per postal code. These are for young women, young men. Weston is not noticeably higher than the rest of Winnipeg, but North Point Douglas clearly is significantly higher, both for women and for men. We also looked at the number of youth aged 12 to 19 with a substance use disorder, whether it be alcohol or drugs. And here, the rest of Winnipeg on the left, WES is Weston. The young women there had a significantly higher incidence of substance use disorder, a little bit, but not much of an increase in the boys. And in North Point Douglas, both the girls and the boys, 12 to 18, had an increased incidence of substance use disorder. I'm not going to go into much in terms of addictions in the rest of the talk, but there is clearly a link between lead and addictions as well. This is the number of young women aged 13 to 19 who are hospitalized for attempted suicide. There weren't proportionately all that many in men, but there were more suicides in women. And in Weston, it was significantly higher. And in North Point Douglas, it was quite significantly higher than in the rest of Winnipeg. And as I said earlier, it's not proven, but we're very concerned that suicide may be more likely as a result of lead exposure. Just to give a provincial perspective, there are locations outside of Winnipeg with high blood levels from the ones that we were able to get in Portage-la Prairie, in Brandon, in Dauphin, in Selkirk, and Flin Flon. Pine Falls and Sagging, and this is tests which were done in this area could come from either one, and we don't know whether the positive tests there were from Pine Falls or Sagging. There's concern in First Nations community. There's not significant data in Manitoba. There is data from 3 communities around James Bay, remote communities, showing that not long ago, there were 18% of the population that was sampled there had high lead levels, and that was above 10 micrograms per deciliter. So if you use the 5 micrograms per deciliter cutoff, it would be higher than that, and that's quite concerning. I mentioned the exposure from gasoline sniffing from the 70s, but there's also concern about residential schools, which had white lead paint on the walls and lead ceiling tiles, and a concern about wild game, where people are hunting using lead shot in First Nations communities. And at this point, it's really a concern, but it's an unknown. Now, in the legislature last November, I asked now former Health Minister Cameron Friesen if he'd monitor blood lead levels in children in areas like Point Douglas. He said no, but he did say every family and their doctor can monitor levels of blood. And so one of the things that could be done in Point Douglas is to, where there are concerns, see if you can get children to talk to their doctors about getting blood lead levels done. From this work on lead and brain health, I think that there's 4 in particular actions which need to be done, and we can discuss this. We should be screening children who are at risk for high blood lead level. Okay, that's children age 1 to 3 living in an area where lead exposure may be higher. children age 1 to 3, where there are concerns the mother or the children may have had lead exposure, an older house with lead paint, eating country food, which may have lead shot, parent working in a lead industry, and so on. Children with ADHD, children with other learning or behavioral difficulties, children and youth with anxiety and depression, children in child and family services care. There's a study in Pennsylvania showing that children in CFS care had very high levels of lead exposure. We don't know here what the situation is, but it is a potential concern. Youth with substance abuse issues. We need to have a standard province-wide protocol for children where the blood lead level is high. What is being used in general in other jurisdictions where the blood lead levels are 2 to 5 micrograms per deciliter, that's 0.1 to 0.23 micromoles per liter. Parents should be talked to about sources of lead and about nutrition. Nutrition turns out to be extraordinarily important because the lead comes into the body through the calcium transporter. And if children are not getting enough calcium in their diet, they're much more likely to have lead absorbed and high lead levels than if they have good levels of calcium in their diet, and that would usually be from milk and milk products. Where the blood levels are above or at 5 micrograms per deciliter or more, we should be looking at the potential sources of lead, very critically, and provide advice on measures to reduce lead exposure, advice in relationship to nutrition. As I said, particularly adequate calcium in milk. There should be an assessment of the child development, learning, and behavior. Now, the government of Manitoba, Kate, has allocated money for lead remediation, right? So I think that your Residents Association in Point Douglas should approach the government of Manitoba about getting access to this money for lead remediation. And you'll have a better case if you've got some children in Point Douglas who've got high lead levels and they can target the sources of those high lead levels. Second, we need to change the water pipes. First, to all schools. There are apparently 6 schools in Winnipeg which have lead pipes. Other jurisdictions have focused on eliminating lead water pipes going to schools. As I said, there are 6 schools. We don't know which ones they are because the government won't tell us. But this should be an urgent need which is addressed. Fourth, we should set a timeline for replacement of all lead pipes to existing homes with lead pipes. Now, Regina has already said that they are going to replace all existing lead water pipes by 2025. And Montreal and Halifax are also acting slightly different timelines. In Halifax, in particular, they've said that they would cover the cost for both the public and the private lead pipes. And that's important in an area like Point Douglas, Kate. Currently in Winnipeg, lead pipes on city property are only replaced when there's a break in the pipe, and pipes on private property are only replaced at the same time if the property owner foots the bill. It's not good enough. Because of the threat to people's health, all lead water pipes, whether on public or private property, should be removed and replaced at public expense, because this is a public health issue. And there are a responsible timeline. I suggest perhaps 2027. We're getting started a little bit later than Regina should be set to complete this. Where there are lead water pipes, one temporary solution until those lead water pipes are removed is to use filters which remove the lead. And the The simplest of these is a Brita filter, and you can take the water and you can filter it through this filter and get rid of the lead, so that the water is then safe to drink. And these filters cost about $25. So they are a significant expense, but, you know, we should, as a province and a city, you know, provide such filters to homes with lead pipes so that we eliminate the risk of Winnipeggers getting high lead levels in their drinking water. And lastly, we need to survey homes in Winnipeg for lead paint and provide that information to homeowners. You know, we're talking about older homes built before 1978. That's not so long ago, right? And it was interior paint was changed in 1978, and exterior paint was not discontinued until 1990. So this is important, and it's important for many areas of Winnipeg because there were a lot of homes built before 1978. But we need to get a better understanding of the extent of the problem and its contribution to high lead levels in kids and adults. It's interesting that if you go back to the 1950s, the paint that was used, approximately 50% of the weight of that paint was lead. And over the 60s and 70s, there was a decrease in lead use, so that the paints in 1978 would have had less lead, but still significant. And I think by 1978, about a quarter of the homes being painted didn't have lead paint, but 75% of homes in Winnipeg in 1978 still had lead. This is an important question. Is the impact of lead exposure lifelong? In the published literature, it's often stated that the impact on learning and intelligence is not reversible. I think this was really in part because people didn't understand brain plasticity and because there weren't really good studies of this. There's a major study that's often quoted. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but it's a very flawed study. In the current context, they didn't do a good job of getting rid of the exposure to lead. Much less was done than was done in Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, and so it really is discredited. The study which I showed you of the violent crime of Billings and Schneppel in 2018, what they showed was that early intervention can reverse the impact on violent crime. And they also showed it can improve school learning, although not quite as much. There's anecdotal evidence. I talked to an individual who grew up in the Weston area. He said that when he was growing up in an area where there was high lead contamination. He really couldn't learn well in school because his mind was cloudy, foggy. Luckily for him, his family moved out of that area when I think he was a late teenager. Now, many years later, he's been a very successful real estate salesman. And in his case and others, there really is evidence that the impact can be significantly reversed. What we do know is that if you don't intervene, the lead exposure can impact adult health and particularly mental health. Should you be concerned about lead exposure all your life? Yes. Lead exposure can increase the likelihood of dementia on some evidence. Information on low lead levels in adults is less than for children. But as I've pointed out, there's really good data saying that low levels of lead can have an impact on adult mental health. Lead is stored for a long, long time in bones, years. Some conditions will increase the release of calcium and lead from bones. If a mother is pregnant and doesn't get enough calcium in her diet, the growing fetus will, in essence, call for more calcium from the mother and will put calcium in the bones. And what will happen is that the message from the fetus to the mother is to take calcium from the bones, right? If there's not enough in the blood from the diet. And this actually sets up a dangerous situation, because when the calcium is released from the bone, lead is as well. And so pregnancy is very important to understand that lead gets across the placental barrier. If a mother doesn't have enough calcium in her diet, the lead and calcium are taken from her bones and get into her growing infant. Inactivity. We know that inactivity is associated with lead or calcium coming out of the bones. Many years ago, as an example, there were kids who had polio. They were put in an iron lung and immobilized. Those kids had so much calcium coming out of their bones that they were getting calcium kidney stones. And so inactivity, not being active is associated with calcium coming out of your bones, and so other stresses too. So one reason why you want to be active is to prevent the lead from coming out of your bones and into your body. So put it all together, lead poisoning is still a big issue for the brain and mental health of Manitobans. We need to be concerned about this. We need to be acting. I've written a report. Our Liberal caucus has put together a report, Lead and Crime in Manitoba. It's on my John Gerard MLA website. You can Google John Gerard MLA and it'll get you there. And it's fairly prominent on that. So open it up for questions. I don't have the chat function so available, but I'll leave this up, and anybody who's got questions, just unmute yourself and ask them. Lloyd.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. It's a very worthwhile study and presentation that you've made. I just wonder if there's a correlation between lead poisoning and mercury as well, and that's a bad combination. In areas like Weston, had a lot of mercury, coming from the railway and transportation industry. So I wonder if there's been any bringing together of that information.
Okay, so yeah, it has been pointed out in some of the literature that areas where you've got airlines and railway transportation are areas where you're more likely to have higher lead exposure. That the combination of lead and mercury, we know that quite often there is a synergism between toxins. That is to say that if you combine two toxins, you get a greater effect than you might predict from either one alone or even adding the two. I don't know of studies, quite frankly, which have looked at the combination of lead and mercury. But it is, it's a good point and it's a good concern.
Okay, Jean has a question. She's just going to unmute here.
Thank you. Thank you. What I wanted to ask is, I understood that governments want to reduce populations in prison. The $7,000 to help to remediate lead in water pipes and other sources seems like the cost of about less than a month for keeping someone in prison. If we approach the government by comparing the increased likelihood of somebody ending up in prison because he has behavioral problems, he or she, and the cost of keeping that person in prison, then $7,000 seems like a bargain. So I just wanted to know if there's any work being done comparing perhaps the lead content in the bloodstream of prisoners with the cost that would have been saved from if we could have kept them out of jail.
Yeah, it is. There have been numerous studies looking at the cost benefit of addressing lead, of mitigating lead, and what they have shown is that the net benefits from making the investments are significant, and that it's very worthwhile that we as a society, we as a province, make these investments. So far, this is an area, sadly, which previous governments and to some extent the current government have fumbled rather than being ready to tackle head on. The NDP had a lot of information on lead contamination in areas like Point Douglas and Weston, but they didn't release it, and it was not released for 10 years after when governments changed. And there hasn't been the attention to measurement of blood lead levels. There's been no sort of random samples of blood lead levels. There's been measurement of soil lead and a lot of work done on soil lead, but what all the efforts in the United States and many other areas shows is that you need to know what the blood lead levels are in kids in different areas and where they're exposed to lead. And when you've got that information, you can make a much better case to go to government and say, we want this. Now, as I said, the Conservatives have put in place a fund for lead remediation, but it's not entirely clear what the parameters are for who can apply. Clearly there's, I think, effort and work needed from groups like the Point Douglas Residents Association to access this money and to make a difference in their community. Lead has been called the #1 environmental toxin for children in the United States because of the widespread use of lead. That is saying a lot, and it is sad that we in Canada and Manitoba haven't paid more attention to it.
Lloyd, are you raising your hand there, I think?
Lloyd?
We were in Pompeii a couple of years ago, and I was absolutely amazed at seeing the lead pipes that were exposed in that ancient city. And I can just imagine, what the impact you mentioned, Rome, and the decline of the Roman Empire. And those lead pipes were still there at Pompeii. Federation of Canadian Municipalities has money available to help community groups and municipalities to examine issues like this, and perhaps a study done of the Point Douglas area using the information that's available would help make a case to the city of Winnipeg and to the government of Manitoba in terms of directing some of the funds that might be available for remediation. So just suggesting that as a source to help with further making a case.
Kate, I'm and my colleagues here in the Liberal caucus would be very interested in working with you and trying to find sources of funds for you and putting together, you know, the evidence and the effort to try and make a difference for Point Douglas. I think you're on there.
I got it. Yeah, we would be very interested also. As I said, we've been working and recently we've had recently somebody do a snow study for us to see what's in our snow, because that's what's going into our water and so on. So, and we are just right now really kind of getting our dander up about it, if I may put it that way. So if we could work with you, that would be absolutely wonderful. We'd like to bring this to the attention of every government that could be doing something about it. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah.
I did get her contact information, John. I think Bonnie was trying to raise her hand there. Okay.
Bonnie.
You know, as in all things, it's very sad that the governments don't understand that it's a domino effect. So we don't take care of lead poisoning, we have an increase in mental health issues and crime, which back ends and affects the efficiency of the hospitals, the distribution of medication, the onus and the burdens on the doctors and the medical health professionals. This is not just about Point Douglas or Weston or certain areas that have concentrated lead. It affects every single person's life. And I think we just need to make a really big shout out. It needs to be a survey that goes to each and every household, and it needs to be the onus of every person who owns a house to participate in this and to care and to push the governments, because, you know, they're all whining about there's no money for this and there's no money for that, but we're spending millions and billions of dollars on mental health programs and hospitals and ambulances and misuse of our police and on and on and on. If we just stop that food chain, that circle of events just in one place, it's going to have that effect throughout every level of society. Doesn't matter what area you live in, or whether, you know, whether my house has lead pipes or not, or what, you know, what my exposure is or not. I care about what happens to the rest of Manitoba, rest of Winnipeg, and I think everybody else should as well. We can't just excuse people for not participating or not being alert to it. We really have to make this a responsibility of every citizen. Anybody who pays taxes should be concerned about what's going on. This is how our money's expended. You know, we are actually the employers of the government. And if we don't, say to them, hey, you're not doing a good job, I'm paying you, you're not doing what I'm paying you for, and it's affecting our future, our investment in our children, generations to come, we have to hold them accountable. And the way to do that is to make a lot of noise. And John has started the ball rolling by providing us with really acute information. And now it's up to us as concerned individuals to take a stance and make a lot of noise about this. Anyways, that's my 2 cents worth.
Any other questions? Crystal? No, you're okay? Good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you all for attending. I want to thank in particular Bonnie, because Bonnie, when I told her I was talking to a group of pediatricians, said, I want to hear that talk. So I said, I'll give that talk, but I'll modify it a little bit so it's not just for pediatricians. So we focus a little more about mental health than I did on that earlier talk. So thank you, Bonnie. You know, I'm ready to talk to others, you know, people in Point Douglas, if you like, or elsewhere, to just try and spread the word. And I think it's a really important issue, and we need to get on it for the health of all Manitobans. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks, John, and your team. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys.